Good evening. My name is Rick Wilson. I'm a member of the faculty of the Columbus Roberts Department of Religion. Welcome, please, to the 30th Annual Harry Vaughan Smith Lectures, also known as the place and time where we introduce our visiting distinguished professor of religion. Before I get cranked up, I want you to crank down. Find your telephone. Make sure your ringer is off. If you choose to have your phone on vibrate and you get a call that's going to take you away, please have the courtesy to absent yourself from this auditorium so we don't try to figure out who you're talking to and about what. Thank you very much for your kind attention and observation. This morning, in the first lecture of 3, Dr. Godsey gave us big ideas in small packets, big ideas in gravitons, electrons, touching upon the whole idea of quantum theory, little packets that have a big impact on a much larger world. As a prelude to that this morning, my good colleague Dee Bratcher gave us an extensive introduction to Kirby Godsey. Everything that you want to know about Kirby Godsey, the noun, as he mentioned this morning, is found in the program. 5 degrees, 27 years as president of Mercer University, 5 books published. We're looking for more. But I want to build upon the morning's lecture. I don't want to talk about Kirby Godsey, the noun. I want to talk about Kirby Godsey, the field, the presence, and the verb. Kirby Godsey has been, as long as I've known him, close to 35 years, a force field. There's something that happens when Kirby Godsey is in the room or when Kirby Godsey puts himself in a position of leadership. He draws people into his world of ideas, and then he sends them out into their world of hope and possibility. So Kirby Godsey makes his own field, and some of us are happy to find ourselves at one time or another in his orbit. Kirby Godsey also is the embodiment of compassion. He demonstrates compassion in the way he deals with other people. I can tell you stories and stories of international students that came to Mercer University, no friends, no money, and Kirby and Joan took them in, and they were regulars at their Sunday lunch table. Kirby lives out his compassion, as does Joan. And for that, we are tremendously grateful. Kirby Godsey is also a realist. In the question and answer period this morning, he was very realistic about the reality of evil in our world. And he says, we need to develop the long look rather than be discouraged by the short look. That is a characteristic verb in Kirby Godsey's life and his bearing. And Kirby, we thank you for your verbness, and we appreciate your nounness as well. Already in our previous gathering, we were able to greet 2 sons and a daughter of Pat and Jenny Smith, Paul, Lynn, and Lisa. Thank you. Again, I don't know if you're doing it on purpose, but that's the pew that your parents always sat in. And if I remember correctly, you were just on the other side of the armrest. And most of the time over the last 20 years, I sat on that pew with your dad and mom. Please give them our deep love, appreciation, and best wishes. And Kirby, come and tell us the truth about God.
Thank you, Rick. It was Rick actually who cajoled me into giving these lectures, and cajoled is probably the right word, but I also want to express, as I did at dinner, express appreciation for the presence of Paul and Lynn and Lisa here today, and to acknowledge the absence of Pat and Virginia. They have been here, I think, for every lecture until this year, and we send them our love and appreciation. They are a part of the character of this institution. We thank you all for representing them and being here in their stead. I thank the Religion Department for inviting me to give these lectures. The morning lecture was a bit musty, perhaps, for some, dealing in a bit of metaphysics, but I hope that the power of relationality, as I call it, of relatedness, had some resonance for those of you who heard that lecture. This evening, I want to talk about the myth of God. Because every speaking of God is a myth. We have no God facts. We only have God stories. Now, we should not confuse myth with untruth. Better to think of myth perhaps as unfactual. The notion of myth includes story and parable and poetry and images that spark our imagination. Jesus frequently used myth to describe the kingdom of God. That may be in part because the kingdom of God is not a place to go. It is a way to experience being in the world. Every great world religion might be thought of as a song of the universe. They are collections of beautiful and compelling and inspiring stories of fear and hope, stories of failure and success. They are stories of suffering and healing, stories of life and death. Those myths and stories keep us going in a troubled world. While we may preach and proclaim the story that has captured us, it may do so with vigor and energy. I hope we will get beyond trying to tear down the stories and the myths of others from which they may have gained hope and peace. Religious myths are not right or wrong. They are believed or not believed. They are followed or not followed. The truth of your God story does not depend on the falsehood or the untruth of the story of others. It is a mistake, I think, to conceive of myth as fanciful tales to be cast aside in the dustbin of obsolescence when we grow up. I rather think of our stories of God as a sacred plasma that integrates our lives. A life without music is soulless. A life without God's story leaves us empty, wandering without a way. living without a rudder. We are fractured without what I call the sacred plasma that centers our souls. You see, I'd rather think of our stories of God as the sacred plasma that integrates our lives. This brief stretch of time between being born and dying is a cosmic moment. It is that. Should not be thought of as a span of years. It is a moment in which our creative presence, which has never been here before, our creative presence can become a part of redeeming the chaos. The question for each of us is whether we become a force for bringing more order into the world, which seems to be continually drowning in tragedy, or whether we add to the chaos. Are we a creative force for good, for civility, for hope, or do we spend our lives tearing down? When speaking of the myth of God, I take just a moment, to speak about the existence of God. Only to say that our stories and myths of God are not about proving the existence of God. In human history, there have been some great theologians that offered some magnificent proofs for the existence of God, none better known than Thomas Aquinas, and it's worth reading. They were compelling stories, but not persuasive. Our stories nurture our imagination and insight, helping us experience the presence of God. It is also the case that God's existence is not a matter of scientific exploration. I represent the view that there is no rational explanation of God. When we come to the limits of thought and reason, we turn to symbol, to myth, and story. All reason can lead toward wisdom, but all wisdom does not spring from reason. The symbolic representations of God in myth and story are more insightful, more powerful than our frail logic. We do not often turn to logic to find peace, to find joy, to find compassion. It is important not to impose on God the limitations of existence. Everything that exists will one day not exist. Stars burn out, as will our sun. Galaxies collide. Black holes devour whole universes. Existence is a passing state of affairs. Our stories of God transcend the boundaries of space and time, neither of which has any meaning outside existence. For the moment, let go of the idea of the existence of God and begin to envision the godness of the universe. A godness, I believe, with which we can align our lives. By godness, I mean something analogous, underscore analogous there, to an ultimate force field or energy field like I discussed this morning. You recall in the morning lecture, I commented the world is made up of two kinds of stuff. They call it fermions and bosons. Fermions are matter fields such as electrons and protons, and they take up space. Bosons are energy fields. Energy has the upper hand. Everything that exists is an exhibit of energy. What we observe as particular things, which we create in the seeing of them, is simply a quanta of energy. Quantum of energy. When we speak of God, we're not speaking of a person that exists somewhere out there in time and space. Existence takes up space and time. I mean, you don't just exist abstractly. You exist somewhere, and you exist sometime. And the somewhere and the sometime is the unique field of relatedness. God, on the other hand, is neither spatial nor temporal. The reality of God lies beyond such trivial boundaries. There is not a whereness or whenness to the reality of God. We might think of God as the ultimate energy of the universe. I use Godness here to help us get beyond naming God as a thing or an entity or an object in the world. Rather, we should think of God as pervading all that exists. Everything that exists is an elaboration of God's presence. Everything bears the imprint of God, and nowhere for me is that more beautifully described than in the early chapters and stories of Genesis. In these Genesis stories, we find trust and doubt, pain and regret, fear and certainty. We find the display of jealousy and arrogance and futile self-sufficiency. We find resentment and hatred. We find hope and new dawnings. Above all, we see ourselves as creations of God to oversee our world, our good earth, as it crawls out of the abyss of chaotic, even ruthless behavior. The stories of Genesis suggest that God creates us in His own image to become creators, to become voices for the breaking of new light. You and I are the offspring of God. That is the message, I believe, of the myth of God in Genesis. Everything that exists can and will not exist. When we speak of dying, we're really speaking of the end of time. Saying that death is the end of being is simply saying far more than we know. Death may not be the end of life or being. Death sheds the conditions that limit us. You and I live between what I like to call the not yet and the no longer. We live in that brief window. And in that brief window, the facts about your life are surely significant, but they do not fully disclose your presence here. That's because your being is more than a collection of years. It is precisely when we let go of the definitions of God and of ourselves as time-bound, space-bound realities that we can become open to an experience of Godness that transcends existence. God walks alongside us in the gardens of our lives, whether well cultivated or overrun with briars and weeds. God is with us in the successes and failures of our lives. The God presence within us means that though we may fail, we are never failures. You never exist, I believe, outside the presence of God. The psalmist said it rather beautifully. Psalmist wrote, "If I go to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, you will hold me fast." You and I never exist, never step outside the presence of God. No matter how far we go, God is there. No matter the crimes we commit, or no matter the egocentric madness that sometimes captures us, we never reside outside the embrace of God. God holds us even when we are blind to God's presence. Even our most chaotic and abysmal behavior, God is brooding over us, waiting for us to see the light that burns within. The myth of God can provide meaning and understanding for what on earth we're doing here. But that myth cannot be established as a fact of existence. You will never learn enough facts to give you meaning. Our visions and stories of God are not facts to be accepted. They're not information to be processed. They're more like guiding lights to help us find our way in a shadowy world. Our stories of God among peoples of the earth diverge. We have no place to stand to assert that another person's story is false. We can affirm the truth of our story that is central and life-defining for us. We can confess it and proclaim it. At the same time, we should learn to be more respectful of the stories of others. The value and importance of our God stories can become clouded by our own religious experience. I want to describe 4 ways in which our stories or myths of God have been distorted and twisted by the telling of our stories. The first is to clarify the distinction between myth and between truth and fact. The second is how religion has sometimes obscured the power and wisdom of our stories. The third is how the power of myth is diminished by our yearning for certainty. We just have to be right. And the fourth is how the shackles of excessive masculinity have distorted our telling of the Jesus story. First, we should become aware of the distinction between fact and truth. I spoke of the importance of fact in a previous lecture. However, we should learn that facts and truth are not interchangeable. When a judge asks us, "Do you swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" she is wanting you to ensure the court that what you say corresponds to what you actually know. On the other hand, if we ask if someone is a true friend, we're asking a very different question. We may be asking whether they're trustworthy and reliable. Will they be there when the morning comes? In logic, truth and false are characteristics of propositions. In order to determine whether a statement is true, we may look to see if it corresponds to what is actually going on. If someone says it's raining outside, we go to the window and look, or we walk outside. Better deck an umbrella. In mathematical truth, We cannot know that 2 plus 2 equals 4 simply by observation. It is easy enough to see that 2 apples plus 2 apples equals 4 apples, but 2 raindrops plus 2 raindrops is just a small puddle of water. And 2 eggs plus 2 eggs probably makes 1 good omelet. Mathematics then relies more on logic and inference than on the senses. I wish actually I could spend more time talking about mathematics. I regard mathematics to be the discipline closest to philosophy, and it pervades all our learning, from music and art to chemistry and physics. Matters of fact are different from matters of faith. When Jesus said, "The truth will set you free," I think he was not saying that the facts will set you free. The Christian faith or the Muslim faith is not about agreeing to somebody's set of facts. Our faiths are not about knowing the facts. They're about seeing the truth and becoming the truth. The symphonies of Beethoven are not significant because of the fact of their existence. They're significant because they cause the human spirit to soar. You see, great novels are not great because they're factual. Actually, they're not. I used to have a philosophy professor who said, the important thing about a proposition is not whether it's true, but whether it's interesting. Well, War and Peace is not considered one of the great novels of all time because it provided us with new data, new information. It shed new light on the human condition and explores the deepest dimensions of human character. The novel helps us understand that truth of our lives is greater than the facts of our lives. Second, organized religion sometimes has the tragic effect of diminishing the power of our God stories. In every world religion, the stories that gave them birth can become obscured by our honest and constructive efforts to spell out doctrines and creeds and affirmations of faith. We develop complex religious systems. Many who walk away from their traditions of faith do so not because they were not inspired. They leave because the religion which inspired them has turned into a system that alienates and stokes fierce winds of guilt. Organizations of religion are worthy human attempts to preserve our stories. I do not suggest tearing them down. However, by developing large corporate structures, we may, as Christians, for example, lose sight of the transformative presence of Jesus as the center of our faith, a presence that simply opens our eyes to a new way of being in the world. We cannot establish much about the facts of Jesus, or the fact of the crucifixion, or the fact of the resurrection. I have listened personally to countless Easter Sunday sermons, have been trying to make a case once and for all for the factness of the resurrection. I suspect that these facts are out of reach. It is the rich stories of faith and the transformative changes of heart, not the facts, that become the soil that sprout disciples and evangelists. Religions at war with one another expose that our myths sometimes become broken. Competing religious myths, say Christianity, Islam, are like feuds among children. But as we have seen, those feuds can have very tragic consequences. Faith itself becomes a justification for killing, a justification for discrimination, a justification for exclusivity and bigotry. The best means of overcoming this arrogance, begins with a willingness to listen and to respect the story that has inspired others. Authentic respect is the best antidote for religious arrogance. In our diverse midst of mud, God may be called Allah, enlightenment, Yahweh, Logos, the Brahman, the way, the truth. In every case, however, what is known of God come from the myths that gave them birth. I believe that Christians will be greatly strengthened and profoundly enriched by the humility to allow new and fresh names and images of God to flow into their hearts and minds. The challenge of our faith is not to prove that our religion is right and yours is wrong. Our faith is not about affirming the right beliefs. It's about becoming the right person. They're about recovering the inner truth of your being. Third, our myths are diminished by what I call the plague of certainty. Certainty is simply not a prize that religion has to offer. In our faith, we are too eager to turn stories into science, too eager to turn myths into history. When we do, our religions become mere fossils. Religion should begin with the confession of uncertainty. None of us knows enough to be absolutists in our religious convictions. We should see conviction as commitment rather than certainty. Uncertainty is the universal human condition. Genuine commitment is a far more stable than arrogant certainty. For Christians, believing in Jesus has little to do with establishing the certainties that surround his existence. Christians have tried to explain how God is able to forgive us because Jesus died for us. They call it substitutionary atonement, I think. I think Jesus did not die because God needed or wanted him to die. Jesus died because people were threatened, even blinded by his presence, and wanted him out of the way. God forgives because that is the character of God. Forgiveness is the character of God, not because Jesus died on a cross. Surely by now, we should let go of the heresy of substitutionary atonement. The Christian faith offers a vision in which Jesus becomes a new way of seeing our lives, a new path on which to walk. Jesus was not bringing to the disciples a new set of certainties to learn. He brought them a new way of living to embody, a new God moment to experience. Believing is far more about following than affirming. We should not substitute reciting our creeds for following Jesus. Fourth, I want to discuss one further way we've diminished the myth of God, especially in Western traditions. I think that our stories of God in Christianity have been shackled by excessive masculinity. In reality, every human being is both masculine and feminine. Each of us is a mixture of the two. If a male lives against his feminist character, he becomes brutish. If a female lives against her masculine character, she becomes passive and often victimized. The masculine and the feminine are different dimensions of our relatedness and interdependence. In the Chinese principle of the yin and the yang, the yin is feminine, the yang is masculine. They are complementary forces that are present in our interconnectedness with one another. The masculine and the feminine are interactive characteristics of every person. Talking is masculine, listening is feminine. We need to do both. Commanding, directing is masculine. Relating and nurturing is feminine. Christian stories of God and Jesus are too often seem to hide the full sanctity of the feminine. Jesus as Savior, God as power, masculine images. The cross is masculine. The resurrection is feminine. It seems somewhat strange that we have diminished the feminine within Jesus, since so much of his life involved interacting with women. He was born of a woman, at least mythically, without male intervention. Many of his parables are centered about women in a culture that was dominated by men. The woman at the well, the woman washing his feet. It is women who stood by the cross while the men fled. It is women who stood at the tomb when he was buried. It was women who were first present at the resurrection. The men had to be coached by women. The Gnostic Gospels are perhaps generally more feminine in their presentation of Jesus than the canonical Gospels. Mary Magdalene may be seen as the best representation of the feminine dimension of the Incarnation. Some scholars, such as Vaughan and Pagels, argue forcefully that the Incarnation cannot be understood fully apart from Mary Magdalene. I've often quipped that men are rational, women are wise. Well, I mean, of course, that reason is masculine, wisdom is feminine. In my morning lecture, I spoke of substance and relation as different windows or categories for seeing into the nature of reality. Substance is masculine, particles masculine, relating is feminine. Receptive, nurturing, relational, non-hierarchical are feminine dimensions of our human character. The persistent and important presence of Mary Magdalene displays the feminine dimension of God's presence. Reason is logos, wisdom is Sophia. God is both the power of reason and the gift of wisdom within each of us. While reason may light your path, loving will save your soul. One might argue that the male-dominated church councils in selecting our biblical canon obfuscated the feminine, leading the church into episodes of subtle and sometimes aggressive misogyny. We have excessively closed our Christian myths in masculine images. God is Father. God is ruler. God is power. We diminish or fail to give as much emphasis that God is merciful, God is comforter, God is lover. I believe Jesus would teach us that the masculine and the feminine are both central dimensions of our relatedness. We need not only to speak, we need to listen. We need not only to be strong, we need to acknowledge our vulnerability. We need not only to establish justice, we need to show mercy. God is present in both Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and God's presence within us generates not only the energy of reason and analysis, but also the power of love and grace. It is time to unburden our stories of God from the imprisonment of the masculine. We need to allow the creative flow of the universe to make our myths of God more akin to the interdependence of the masculine and feminine dimensions of our lives. In summary, by exploring the myth of God, I've wanted to help us see that our religions are not based upon factual truth alone. Most of our religious convictions cannot be demonstrated to be factually true. Faith is a risk. Faith is a risk. The truth of our religious convictions has to be found in the living of them. The teachings of our religion alone will not satisfy the longings, the deep longings in our hearts. Embrace the myth. Celebrate the story. Far from being a source of doubt, our stories of God are the greatest reservoir for gaining hope and light. They help us attune ourselves to the inner music, the inner light of our interrelated lives and our mutual participation in God's presence. The myth of God does not weaken us. It strengthens and enlightens us as we find our way in an uncertain world. My central word is this: the real power of our God stories lies in becoming a part of the story. It lies in the intersection of your story with the God story. In Christian terms, it means allowing the Jesus story to change your life script. The Christian story has never been about worshiping Jesus. That requires no courage at all. It is about following Jesus, a profoundly difficult commitment to keep. Now, as I said this morning, I would close each lecture with what as a tribute to Harry. So a closing word about how our understanding of God can affect the living of our lives. We're asking too much of our religions. We're depending too much on words and seeking security through the certainty that our religion is the right religion. Listen and be silent. There's not a God fact to be worshiped. There's the presence of God within you and within the world, which was embodied for Christians in the Jewish story. Following Jesus changes the rhythm of your life. Above all else, remember that your own story is profoundly sacred. It is a story that will radically change by seeing yourself as a unique gift of God, God's creative presence in the world. God has never created another one of you. Every one of you is a gift of light to the world. God has never created another one of you. Become the light that you were born to become. There's a sacredness to your being on which you can lean. Follow the way of Jesus. Embrace the truth of Jesus. Live the life of Jesus. Thank you very much.